Adele. Adele's biggest album is 21 with the sales of 36 million copies, and her biggest song is Rolling in the Deep with the sales of 20.2 million copies. Taylor Swift. Taylor's biggest album is Fearless with the sales of 12 million copies, and her biggest song is Shake It Off with the sales of 10 million copies. Rihanna. Rihanna's biggest album is Good Girl Gone Bad with the sales of 8 million copies, and her biggest song is Love the Way You Lie with the sales of 18 million copies. Ariana Grande. Ariana's biggest album is My Everything with the sales of 3.5 million copies, and her biggest song is Seven Rings with the sales of 13.3 million copies. Celine Dion. Celine's biggest album is Falling Into You with the sales of 32 million copies, and her biggest song is My Heart Will Go On with the sales of 18 million copies. Lady Gaga. Gaga's biggest album is The Fame with the sales of 15 million copies, and her biggest song is Poker Face with the sales of 14 million copies. Janet Jackson. Janet's biggest album is Janet with the sales of 20 million copies, and her biggest song is That's the Way Love Goes with the sales of 10 million copies. Mariah Carey. Mariah's biggest album is Music Box with the sales of 31 million copies, and her biggest song is All I Want for Christmas Is You with the sales of 16 million copies. Kylie Minogue. Kylie's biggest album is Fever with the sales of 6.3 million copies, and her biggest song is I Can't Get You Out of My Head with the sales of 7.3 million copies. Cher. Cher's biggest album is Believe with the sales of 12 million copies, and her biggest song is Believe with the sales of 11 million copies. Jennifer Lopez. Jennifer's biggest album is J-Lo with the sales of 8.3 million copies, and her biggest song On the Floor with the sales of 10 million copies. Britney Spears. Britney's biggest album is Baby One More Time with the sales of 30 million copies, and her biggest song is Baby One More Time with the sales of 9 million copies. Shakira. Shakira's biggest album is Laundry Service with the sales of 14 million copies, and her biggest song is Waka Waka This Time for Africa with the sales of 14 million copies. Beyonce. Beyonce's biggest album is Dangerously in Love with the sales of 11 million copies, and her biggest song is Halo with the sales of 13.3 million copies. Pink. Pink's biggest album is Misunderstood with the sales of 15 million copies, and her biggest song is Just Give Me a Reason with the sales of 9.2 million copies. Whitney Houston. Whitney's biggest album is The Bodyguard Soundtrack with the sales of 45 million copies, and her biggest song is I Will Always Love You with the sales of 20 million copies. Toni Braxton. Toni's biggest album is Secrets with the sales of 15 million copies, and her biggest song is Unbreak My Heart with the sales of 10 million copies. Katy Perry. Katy's biggest album is Teenage Dream with the sales of 7 million copies, and her biggest song is Dark Horse with the sales of 13.3 million copies. Christina Aguilera. Christina's biggest album is her eponymous album with the sales of 14 million copies, and her biggest song is Moves Like Jagger with the sales of 20.2 million copies. Olivia Newton-John. Olivia's biggest album is Physical with the sales of 10 million copies, and her biggest song is You're the One That I Want with the sales of 15 million copies. Madonna. Madonna's biggest album is The Immaculate Collection with the sales of 30 million copies, and her biggest song is Hung Up with the sales of 9 million copies. Barbra Streisand. Barbara's biggest album is Guilty with the sales of 14 million copies, and her biggest song is Woman in Love with the sales of 7 million copies. Tina Turner. Tina's biggest album is Private Dancer with the sales of 20 million copies, and her biggest song is What's Love Got to Do with It with the sales of 5 million copies. Diana Ross. Diana's biggest album is Diana with the sales of 10 million copies, and her biggest song is Endless Love with the sales of 6 million copies.
If you like this video, be sure to subscribe, follow me on my Instagram account, and support our channel by becoming a patron on Patreon, and with a bunch of rewards help us creating together a great content with your favorite artists. Bye.